baptismal fires are waiting. The Steam Deck, like countless PCs before it, must be christened, or dare I say, Crysis. And as with every new piece of hardware, we at Digital Foundry must know, can it run Crysis? In today's video on DF, I will answer that question. You, the viewer, will join me on this journey of ritual punishment. We will see how much the Steam Deck can take before it relinquishes, and we will ponder the optimized settings mortal machines should strive for as they quake in awe of the majesty that is Crysis. So let's get straight to it. Can the Steam Deck run Crysis? No. Okay, that's it for our video. Like, subscribe, smash that. But seriously, the original version of Crysis from 2007 in its fully patched form does not work through the Steam OS in my attempts. When launched, I saw a black screen that never finishes loading. This reminds me of affinity issues I've seen on Ryzen machines in Crysis under the later versions of Windows 64-bit, but all attempts to correct this affinity or replace the EXEs were unsuccessful. So in today's video instead, we will be using Crysis Remastered to put the Steam Deck to the test. This is mostly a big advantage actually for the Steam Deck, as Crysis Remastered in its fully patched form is much more multi-threaded than the original Crysis by far. Check out this shot here. Crysis Remastered on PC at medium, which is most similar to the original Crysis, is very high for draw distance settings, and you can see how the original Crysis is utilizing mainly only one core really effectively. Crysis Remastered in comparison has a much broader CPU utilization, and it's also running a lot better, as you can see, with similar draw distance values. So this bodes well for the deck's 8-threaded CPU and making sure we get the most out of that CPU instead of being incredibly single thread limited like we would be with the original 2007 game. So all is looking well, but as you can imagine, it matters a lot which settings we are using. Crysis Remastered has all the settings to allow us to punch the deck as much as we like. And believe me, we can make it really heavy. Here's Crysis Remastered running at the highest settings in game, at a native 1280 by 800 resolution. Performance is so high you can count the frames per second in real time on one hand. This is about Quake on a 386 levels of performance here, and the Steam Deck is definitely not liking it. Or maybe it is. So if we are going to be playing Crysis Remastered here on the deck, we really have to be mindful of the settings we are using, and only choosing those that are important for the screen size, that pixel density ratio, and only those which meaningfully impact the visuals in most scenes. This unsurprisingly means not using the game's ray-traced reflections. Here is an off-screen shot of the game using ray tracing in an area where it is not exactly obvious. I mean, I can't really see any reflections here. All settings are low except for ray tracing set to the lowest performance mode. The FPS at native res here in this scene where nothing is really happening is 50. Turning off RT though gives us 60 FPS in the scene with a lot of GPU headroom still to spare. So here we're losing 20% of our performance below VSync for literally no visual improvement. Now here is a scene where there is actually a visual improvement from the ray traced reflections, and it being actually visible makes it even more expensive. Here we're 46% below the VSync 60 cap. And this is an incredibly tiny scene with no action going on, and we're almost below 30 FPS. So as you can see, on a power-constrained handheld like the Steam Deck, that type of performance loss for such a situational and small visual gain is not what we're actually going to be doing in this video. Our final settings have to be more meaningful and more performant, so we will definitely not be using ray-traced reflections. So our next question is going to be, can we really hit 60 FPS here on Steam Deck? And to test this, I'm going to look at the game's second level, Village. That level shows off the kind of variety you can see throughout Crysis' campaign. There's some smaller sneaking sections with squads of Koreans surrounded by foliage, and then a large base in the form of a town in the valley, which contains tanks and dozens of AI, as well as a lot of highly explosive material. From testing on PC and console at Digital Foundry, we know that this area is a great place to examine CPU limitations early in the game as if there are CPU limitations here, you'll definitely find some later on as well. So to make sure I was testing the CPU on the deck, I set all the settings to low and used a 540p resolution to keep the GPU underutilized up to that FPS cap. And what I found is intriguing and disappointing at the same time. First of all, the game's performance is a bit deceptive at cursory glances. Some smaller parts of the beginning of the level run at an okay 60 FPS, but you can really quickly see that moment-to-moment movement and gameplay and traversal is filled with a lot of skips and sputters. Moving around and changing the view can cause spikes to 33.3 milliseconds that make the 60 FPS not feel completely smooth. The quintessence of this behavior can be seen when you overlook the town. When you're just sitting there doing nothing, you will see ever-present drops below 60 FPS, wavering skips of frame time up to 33.3 milliseconds that just don't stop. This is worrying performance to hit 60 FPS, but in the town itself is where we see that 60 FPS on the deck is not going to be really possible. When the tanks come out and the AI activates, you'll definitely see dips into the middle to lower 40s, which make the game look visually not too smooth and the controls start to feel inconsistent. So either you can give up here, or I could try out some lower than low settings to hit 60 FPS, which is exactly what I did. Using custom variables I entered into the console, I brought down object shadow draw and vegetation draw at a distance, and I was able to claw back performance, like you see here, up to 60 FPS where it was below before. In the side-by-side it doesn't look too bad, minus the fact that we're at 540p here, of course. The issue is that the cost to fidelity is not worth it for the performance. For one, moving around the game world shows some serious pop-in, as the only way I could bring performance up was to change the distance of vegetation draw, shadow draw, and object draw, so you can see some intense pop-in. Then there's the resolution of 540p. For one, 540p makes Crysis' gameplay not the easiest. Mid-range engagements are fine enough, but anything further out makes enemies rather hard to see on the screen here when at this low resolution. Then there's the performance implication. Resolution usually has nothing to do with CPU limitations, but since we are using the Steam Deck, it shares power draw between CPU and GPU, so any more power going to the GPU at a higher resolution could potentially shift some frequency away from the CPU when you need it most. And then there's the fact that Crysis has CPU performance affected by output resolution, which you can see here. CPU limited scene with the settings I chose, and the only difference is output resolution. Since Crysis is adjusting LOD values based upon that resolution, the lowest resolution on the left runs faster than the highest resolution shown on the right. So if we increase resolution, we could make the game more CPU limited again. And lastly, I wouldn't recommend trying to drop below low settings here to hit 60 in Crysis Remastered on the deck, because it won't be a perfect 60 anyway. You'll still see those sputtery skips up to 33.3 milliseconds, both in movement and, of course, when just sitting still overlooking things that are more CPU intensive. And while the performance is better when the tanks come out, for example, it's still going to be imperfect and below 60 FPS, as you can't really turn off AI or something like that. Really, I just don't think the Steam Deck is up to the task to run Crysis at a really consistent 60 FPS. So my optimized settings in Crysis Remastered here are going to be going for 30 FPS using the Steam OS cap, and I'm going to concentrate on meaningful graphical fidelity at a near native resolution. I say near native resolution, as instead of 1280 by 800, I elect to use 1280 by 720, which is still 1-to-1 pixel mapping, just with some letterboxing, and because reducing vertical resolution means we're going to reduce CPU and GPU load here at the same time, thus getting us more battery life in the end, which is important because the Steam Deck is a handheld machine. So what settings do I use and recommend? This was easy to dial in due to my knowledge from previous reviews of Crysis on desktop PCs. I know that medium settings are roughly where the original Crysis was at with its very high settings, and I also know that some smaller tweaks above those medium settings give us a lot of graphical features that were not there in the original Crysis. So these are my optimized settings for the Steam Deck. Medium for everything except for post-processing and vegetation. Post-processing is set to high for multiple reasons. For one, it gives us access to CryEngine's really nice per-object motion blur. This will help the game at 30 FPS look much smoother than it otherwise would without per-object motion blur. Post-processing is set to high also because of other enhancements like screen space reflections, which help out those fewer, shinier surfaces in the game, but they're also not as expensive as ray trace reflections. Sure, they're not as good, but we're on a handheld here. Then we want to use high vegetation, as high vegetation gives us better foliage coverage than the original Crysis, like you can see here in this overview shot of the town, where the distant mountain has many more trees on it than the original. Medium settings gives us other things as well, like screen space shadows, which you can see on on small objects on the ground, for example. And it also gives us, of course, sparse voxel octree global illumination, so we get really nice light bounce in the game world. I think it's a rather handsome looking game at my chosen settings, and based on my experience, it also runs really well. I played the game's first 4 missions using these settings on the high difficulty, filled with a lot of Predator style stealthing, using the tranquilizer and silenced weapons, picking off enemies one by one. I also did a lot of stupid commando kind of stuff, with a lot of action and explosions, and the frame rate held to 30 FPS throughout it all. There were only 2 exceptions that I could find. First, you have checkpoint saves, which have really always caused stutters in Crysis. Then there are drops to 50 milliseconds that can occur based upon movement, I think, and what you're looking at, and this all seems tied into the way the Steam OS is doing its frame rate cap. For example, here's me spinning the camera with an unlocked frame rate up to 60 with the optimized settings. If you look at the frame times, you can see that they do not really exceed 33.3 milliseconds. So you would imagine a 30 FPS cap here would not be dropping frames while doing this exact same thing. But as you can see here, with the Steam OS cap, you can see that it is dropping frames when the camera turns to view the longer view distance there towards the level start. It happens periodically as the camera is spun towards that location. This happens at my optimized settings as well as the lowest settings, which are far less CPU and GPU intensive. So something about the Steam OS cap, I think, is causing this. But it's not so bad though. For one, it's rather rare in the long stretches of gameplay, and because the alternatives are not great. Unlocked FPS at my settings would see very low battery life and a rather chaotic frame rate. And if you were to try and use the in-game FPS cap by using the unlocked console command, you would see incorrect frame pacing, which is far worse than some occasional drops below 30 FPS. So I think the 30 FPS here is pretty good, but importantly, our settings and the FPS cap have led to generally good battery life. I was able to extract 2.5 hours of pure gameplay out of the battery at these settings. That was enough time to beat the 3rd and 4th level of the game, and I was playing it at a very leisurely pace, with multiple deaths and all that sweet Crysis backtracking, stealth gameplay, and hoorah action. By my standards, that is pretty good battery life. But if you want more battery life, you could try resolution drop to 540p, or you could turn off things like motion blur should you so wish. And there it is. This was my first video talking about performance of a game on Steam Deck, my first Steam Deck video. And of course I had to make it be about Crysis. I think the deck did well here. The game was playable, and it looks great at the settings I found. It's limited to 30 FPS, which is a bit of a bummer, but 60 FPS is not really there, and it might not be there anyway if you care about battery life. So yeah, I would say the Steam Deck can run Crysis, but my question for you in the audience is what you thought about this video. This is my first Steam Deck video, so I want to know if it answered questions you cared about and what else you might want to see. If you did like it though, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support us on Patreon to get years of DF content in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me, write a comment below or follow on Twitter. As always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.